I'm not a grand marshal of Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, nor am I a rock and roll icon who somehow survived the savages of 60s counterculture and 70s psychotherapy. I'm just a schnook. Hello, friends and fellow Schnooks. This is Autobiography of a Schnook, featuring your host, Sean. I am Sean, naturally. How are you? And of course, as I ask that, I realize this is a one-way communication. I can't hear your response in real time, unfortunately. I'm recording this episode as I finish preparing for my upcoming trip to New Jersey, about which you'll hear more in a few minutes, really. Since this is Chapter 1, and ergo the first formal episode, if you will, of Autobiography of a Schnook, I figured I might as well say a few words about some things you might be wondering. Some of you might notice that the graphic that is used for this podcast kind of looks like the flag of Chicago, and that was absolutely intentional. I live in Chicago. My mother and grandmother were both born and raised on the north side of Chicago, and I'm very proud of my Chicago roots, and I absolutely love living here. And I like to get nerdy about the city from time to time. In fact, let me do that right now. Everybody knows that Chicago is called the Windy City, and you probably think it's about the weather. You're going to hear Chicagoans tell you, no, it's not about the weather, it's about the politicians, because there was an article in some newspaper, it might have been the Tribune, in which an editorial referred to the hot air coming out of the politicians, giving the city its nickname, the Windy City. Well, not terribly long ago, the newspaper column The Straight Dope, which originates from the Chicago Reader, uncovered some newspaper articles from before that time that actually did refer to the Windy City as Chicago's nickname because of its weather. The earliest mentions of the Windy City were directly tied to the weather. So if you're saying Chicago's the Windy City because of the weather, you're absolutely right. So next time a Chicagoan tries to correct you on that, send them my way. Tell them, listen to Autobiography of a Schnook. And speaking of listening to Autobiography of a Schnook, you might remember how I said in the intro episode that I really don't know where this podcast is going in terms of its success. I might have 1 listener, 0 listeners. I might have millions of listeners. I really don't know. But what happens if I do have, say, millions of listeners, and this becomes one of the most popular podcasts? Does that make me not a schnook anymore? I don't know, but here's something I'd like you to do. Spread the word. See if we can find out if I'm still a schnook once I get millions of listeners. Tell everybody you know, listen to Autobiography of a Schnook. They'll ask you, what's it about? And you'll say, well, it's a memoir in podcast form. Oh, really? Whose memoirs? Just some random guy that nobody's heard of. So, yeah. And as I record this intro, I'm waiting for Apple to approve the podcast for inclusion on Apple Podcasts and, of course, iTunes, which, well, let's face it, iTunes and Apple Podcasts, in terms of podcasts, they're the same product. They really are. Apple Podcasts, however, is just simply aimed at people who listen to podcasts via a dedicated podcast app. I personally don't. I actually use an Ipod Classic. Why do I use an Ipod Classic? Well, actually, I'm saving that for a segment of a future chapter. So I actually use iTunes to synchronize all my podcasts. One of these days I'm not going to be able to use an iPod, but one of the reasons I use an iPod is that it has that tactile response. You actually have to touch everything, push buttons, and you don't need to look at a screen to operate it. But I know there's going to come a time when this thing's going to die, and I'm trying to stay ahead of that a little bit and investigate alternative music players that I can carry around with me and listen to and switch tracks without having to look at a touch screen. We'll see how that goes. But why don't we get into today's chapter? Today's chapter contains 2 segments. Of course, there is a Music for Schnooks segment, and this chapter's segment will deal with some of my favorite music of all time, specifically the creator behind it. But first, we'll start with a look at how my Thanksgivings have gone over the years. I don't know why, but I have a history of just not doing Thanksgiving right. Don't get me wrong, I love Thanksgiving, and I'm happy to say that I don't have the stereotypical Thanksgiving family, in which the parents utter their controversial dissenting political views and your racist grandparents cause a ruckus. Well, my grandfather was racist to be sure, but I can't say that I've experienced the truly unpleasant Thanksgiving dinner. But that doesn't mean that I've done it right every year. Back when I was a little kid, we either traditionally or habitually, don't know for sure, went to my Uncle Nick's house in Morton Grove, Illinois for Thanksgiving. I was so young at the time that I was so self-centered and shallow. I looked forward to going to Uncle Nick's house because he had a pinball machine in the basement. Yes, I should socialize with my uncle, my aunts, my cousins, but first things first, pinball. I don't recall what year it was, but I remember when my brother, mom, dad, and I were heading downstairs ready to leave our home in Bourbonnais, which is about 60 miles south of Chicago, to go to Uncle Nick and Aunt Dolores' house for Thanksgiving. As I reached the bottom step of the staircase, I suddenly had a feeling of overwhelming nausea, and I couldn't make it to the bathroom on time, and there went our Thanksgiving plans. And so help me God, the following Thanksgiving, the exact same thing happened. I seem to remember my mom calling her brother on the phone and saying, "Nick, you're not going to believe what just happened." You can imagine how wonderful I felt. Nice going, Sean. You ruined another Thanksgiving. Geez, what a schnook. And the following year, let's see if the third time is the charm. Once again, let's try to have Thanksgiving with Uncle Nick's family this time. Well, wouldn't you know it, I did not get sick. I was in perfect health. I was feeling great, except this was the year we had a freak blizzard. A blizzard! On Thanksgiving! Who does that? But at least this time it wasn't my fault. I can't control the weather, and if I could, God knows I would have had a lot more snow days from school than I actually did. But having said that, that was apparently not a Thanksgiving illness curse breaker for me. Flash forward with me to Thanksgiving 1996. I had recently turned 22 years old and had graduated from college that spring. My bachelor's degree was in journalism, with a concentration in radio broadcasting. The previous month, literally the day after my 22nd birthday, I landed a job as an air talent at WYKT, better known as the Cat 105.5 down in Wilmington. I didn't have a regular air shift yet, but I was still part of the staff. As of Thanksgiving 1996, I had been on the air at the Cat exactly once, and for just 1 hour, just to fill in for our midday host who had to leave early for a doctor's appointment. My radio education taught me that you just do not turn down an opportunity to be on the air. So if the station asked me if I was available to fill in, the answer was yes. It didn't matter what the time was, what the date was, or for how long the shift was going to be. I'd sort that out later. Always start with yes. So the next time I was asked to fill in, it was for Thanksgiving. While many people would say, "What time?" and then give a yes or no, I was going the other way around. I said, "Yes, what time?" This time it was an entire shift, 4 hours at the going rate of minimum wage. Thankfully, my family was very understanding when I explained that I had to scram immediately after Thanksgiving dinner. You may have gathered that people don't necessarily get into radio for the money. I knew what I was getting into. The Cat was a small market station outside of the listening range of Chicago. They told us in college to expect minimum wage at a small market station and potentially livable wages in medium market stations. It's the major market stations where you'll be making the big bucks. But I understood. After all, I was a newbie, baby steps. My only real experience at that point was the college radio station, the 50-watt WCSF at the College of St. Francis. Yes, by the way, you heard that right. 50 watts, 50. Good God, just one light bulb at the college's Performing Arts Center had 4 times the power of the WCSF transmitter. But I loved doing radio in college, and I really missed being on the air between graduation and the day Rick Ferguson, who was program manager at the Cat, handed me a t-shirt and said, "Welcome aboard." Naturally, I jumped at the opportunity to do an entire shift, even though it was Thanksgiving. It only now occurs to me that Thanksgiving 1996 kind of brought things almost full circle. My parents were hosting Thanksgiving dinner. Our guests, my Uncle Nick and his wife. And for old time's sake, my body decided to get sick. I had a 102-degree temperature, but at least I didn't puke. I know repeatedly my mom asked me if I was sure that I still wanted to go on the air. Thing is, even if I didn't want to go on the air, it was kind of late to call out and have the station find a sub for the sub. I also argued that if I can have dinner with my family while I'm fighting the flu, then I can make the 15-mile drive from Joliet. We moved to Joliet 10 years earlier. Drive to Wilmington, play some CDs, and talk for a few hours. There was no question about it. The station needed me. And let's face it, I needed the station even more if I wanted to have my foot in that radio door. I really don't remember a heck of a lot from my Thanksgiving on the air other than constantly drinking bottles of any cold soft drink I could find, trying to put out that conflagration in the back of my throat. Thankfully, an air check recording from that day survives among my tape collection, revealing how sick I was. Listeners hearing this new guy on the air probably wouldn't have noticed at all that I was sick, because, after all, they don't know what I sound like normally. But man, I sure thought I sounded sick. And I still notice that when listening to the tape to this day. I must have been performing okay, though, because the owner of the station, I'll just call her Patty, Patty called me during the shift and introduced herself to me. Patty told me she liked what she was hearing and said that the station might have a more permanent shift for me in the near future. So that was nice to hear. Somehow, despite my burning throat and triple-digit fever, I made it through all 4 hours and safely drove home afterwards. I would have one more Thanksgiving while working for that station. In 1998, I had moved to New Jersey to be with a wonderful woman who shortly after became my fiancée, and of course, obviously not quite a year later, my wife. In retrospect, I think it was Lisa who broke me of my not doing Thanksgiving right curse. How do I do Thanksgiving now? Well, I moved to Chicago in 2006. During our first few years in Chicago, Lisa and I would spend Thanksgiving with my parents. But in the last several years, we switched to flying out to New Jersey to spend a few days with Lisa's mother. This annual trip to the shore gave birth to some new Thanksgiving traditions for me. During the flight to New Jersey, I watched Emmett Otter's Jug Band Christmas, which I would watch on HBO during the Christmas season as a child in the early 80s. My new Emmett Otter tradition started actually a few days before Christmas in 2006. Boy, that was a rough year for me. That spring I got a promotion that moved me to Chicago, but Lisa had to stay behind in New Jersey to finish her master's degree. She still had a year to go. We would travel back and forth as much as we possibly could. Thankfully, the airfares were low enough that we could actually afford to. I was waiting for my flight at O'Hare. The plan was that I would go to New Jersey, spend a few days with Lisa and her mom, and then Lisa and I would fly back to Chicago on Christmas and then spend Christmas with my family. Unfortunately, my flight to New Jersey was delayed, and delayed again, and again, and again, you get the point. Thankfully, I'd just loaded up Emmett Otter's Jug Band Christmas on my Ipod Classic. Tiny screen, sure, but at least I had something to watch. I found it via a BitTorrent search. Yes, I know it was piracy, but I couldn't find it on DVD. Apparently, I didn't look hard enough because the torrent I found turned out to be a DVD rip. But anyway, I excused myself to another wing of the airport terminal, and I parked myself at one of the deserted gates. My flight was delayed so late that all the other flights had already left, leaving the other gate areas abandoned. I sat by myself watching the beloved Jim Henson special I had seen many times as a little kid. However, something was missing. I could have sworn Kermit the Frog was in this special, acting as sort of a narrator. Later on, I did some research and found out that, yes, I remembered correctly. Sometime between the last time I saw the show as a child and the time that I sought it out as an adult, the Jim Henson Company sold the Muppets to Disney, but they still had the rights to Emmett Otter's Jug Band Christmas, whose characters were not created by Jim Henson and ergo did not fall under the Muppets umbrella. That meant that when the Emmett Otter DVD was released at first, Kermit had to be cut out unless the Jim Henson Company wanted to pay undoubtedly exorbitant licensing fees to Disney. So I now had a mission. Find the version of Emmett Otter's Jug Band Christmas with Kermit still intact. Someone had to have it. In researching for this mission, I found that there were actually several different versions of Emmett Otter's Jug Band Christmas. Some were missing some scenes, some had extended scenes. There's some other permutations I'm not going to get into right now, basically because there's too many to keep track of. Eventually, I found a website that was offering a DVD for sale that incorporated all known versions of Emmett Otter's Jug Band Christmas, edited together, cleaned up as much as possible, for the most complete Emmett Otter show possible. Needless to say, I sprang for that DVD. Piracy again? Yes, but I wanted my complete Emmett Otter. Plus, the vendor did explicitly ask that you also purchase the official DVD so that those who own the rights would get their dues. So the DVD arrived and I was very happy with it. The video quality was really good for something that was sourced primarily from VHS tapes. Whoever cleaned it up did a very good job. I was quick to rip that DVD and add it to the iPad. Well, technically it's my wife's iPad. I personally am not a fan of iPads and other tablet computers because, well, to me an iPad is just a giant iPhone but without telephony. Honestly, the only thing I've ever really truly used an iPad for besides watching Emmett Otter is for sheet music, so I don't have to fumble with paper. So that's been one of my Thanksgiving traditions for several years now. During the flight to Midway from Newark, ever since Southwest Airlines set up shop in Newark, we've been using Midway instead of O'Hare, I watched the completely intact Emmett Otter's Jug Band Christmas. A new official DVD was released in 2017 that also incorporated all known versions of the special. I have it, but I haven't watched it yet. And I'm going to admit that a big reason I haven't watched it yet is that after I got the DVD, I found out that while it is indeed complete, it was actually cropped to fit on high-definition TV screens. So yeah, technically we still don't have the complete unaltered Emmett Otter's Jug Band Christmas. And to anybody listening who has any say in reissuing things on DVD or any other format that were not meant to fit on a 4:3 ratio, do not crop the video. Just don't. And don't do that pan and scan crap either. Just use the black bars on the side, please. It's okay. Sorry about that. As you can tell, I'm very passionate about Emmett Otter, but there's some other watching that's part of my Thanksgiving. Naturally, we have the Macy's Thanksgiving Parade on TV, more or less for ambiance. Who doesn't? After that, we check out the National Dog Show highlights and see if the Beagles get some nice coverage. Now, it used to be that Miracle on 34th Street, the original 1947 version that is, was at some point on after the parade. But inexplicably, that's no longer the case. So to make up for that, my wife and I bring the DVD of the movie with us to New Jersey, and we watch the movie on DVD at some point, either right before or right after Thanksgiving dinner. I never actually saw that movie until Lisa and I got together. I typically avoided it because I just saw Miracle on 34th Street as, oh, this is just some corny stuff that my mother liked as a kid. But wow, what a great flick. It's full of sly humor, and it has a courtroom scene whose epicness... Oh, shut up, red dotted line. Epicness is a word. A courtroom scene whose epicness rivals that of My Cousin Vinny. Depending on how the stars line up, we might watch a Charlie Brown Thanksgiving. It's not one of our favorite Peanuts specials by far. It's not particularly well done. But we do love making fun of it and philosophizing how dumb somebody has to be to trust a beagle with preparing food. Speaking of Charlie Brown, a new tradition I started last year is to read the book In the Saint Nick of Time by William Pepper. I said speaking of Charlie Brown because Bill is also the host of a podcast called It's a Podcast, Charlie Brown, which is a monthly show about all things Peanuts, especially the animated specials and movies. But In the Saint Nick of Time is a highly enjoyable read. I love it. It takes place in Santa Claus, Indiana. Yeah, Bill just had to go there. And it's about a best-selling novel writer who is dealing with writer's block, and he's also fighting for extended visitation rights with his daughter. And he has a friend named Dogwater who's a conspiracy theorist who claims to be a repeat alien abductee. Despite the title and the fact that Santa himself is one of the main characters, it is not a book for kids at all. It has some dirty words and there are some adult-centric situations, but nonetheless, I highly recommend the book, and I will link both that book and Bill's podcasts. He also hosts an Atari video game podcast that's very creative. I'm going to put those links in the online bibliography. But getting back to how I do Thanksgiving, I was thrilled to move to Chicago and close that New Jersey chapter of my life, but it is nice to go back for a few days and see some of my old haunts. I do put my foot down on one particular thing. I absolutely cannot have a trip to New Jersey without having lunch or dinner at Nagel's in Ocean Grove, at least once. Nagel's is a wonderful comfort food restaurant that, despite what some New Yorkers on Yelp claim, is very clean. Go there. Just shut up and go there. It's really nice. Usually I have a delicious cheeseburger and wash it down with a vanilla Coke. Let me tell you, I've yet to find anywhere else where they make better vanilla Coke, with a perfect proportion of quality vanilla syrup and fountain Coke. Lisa and I lived only a few blocks away from Nagel's for several years, and with their great food and supremely popular ice cream counter that pops up in the summer, I have no idea how we ended up not camping out at Nagel's on a nightly basis. Honestly, though, my favorite part of our New Jersey trips is coming home. I could and probably will sometime go on for hours on why I love living in Chicago. But it seems that every time we take a Thanksgiving trip to New Jersey, there's something exciting going on just in our own neighborhood on the north side when we get back. I guess it's because we live in a great neighborhood for Small Business Saturday, but there's more to it than that. However, with a nice trip for Thanksgiving with some new traditions that I enjoy, and of course the return home, there is a trade-off. I have to spend time in Terminal A at Newark Airport. If I'm really unlucky, I may need to use the men's room, a fate I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. But you know what? I might be jinxing myself by saying this, but I think it's safe to say that I have broken my Thanksgiving illness curse. So that's something. Really though, am I seriously going to be not sick on Thanksgiving for hopefully the rest of my life, which will hopefully be many, many, many more decades? Only time will tell, I guess. But anyway, for this edition of Music for Schnooks, I have a story of meeting somebody's idols and the results thereof, and a story that perhaps addresses the common advice of never meet your heroes. Those of you who are sensitive to certain language, be it implicit or explicit, I will warn you there is a bleeped profanity about 16 and a half minutes into the story. But it still should be safe for work, especially if your coworkers like music. So let's see what might happen when you meet one of your heroes. The date is Tuesday, November 21st, 2006. My new job in Chicago is 6 months in, and I was in New Jersey visiting Lisa for Thanksgiving as she was finishing her master's degree. There was another reason I was there. Our musical hero, Brian Wilson, the troubled genius of the Beach Boys, was doing a show at the Beacon Theater in New York City, performing the Beach Boys' legendary Pet Sounds album for a 40th anniversary mini-tour. I find it interesting, though not surprising, that Brian had said that that would be the last time he'd ever perform Pet Sounds, because he'd done it so many times in the last 6 years, and it was time to move on to other material. I say this as Wilson just winded down a third tour in a row in which he was performing Pet Sounds to mark its 50th anniversary. That's one thing about Brian Wilson that makes him peculiar, yet we love it about him somehow. He'll say one thing and change his mind later. For decades, he swore he'd never finish the infamous Smile album or allow the existing recording sessions to see the light of day. Well, in 2004, he revisited and finished the Smile album, and in 2011, he signed off on a huge box set called the Smile Sessions. Ask Brian Wilson what his favorite Beach Boys album is, and depending on how Jupiter is aligned with Proxima Centauri, he'll tell you either Pet Sounds, Friends, The Beach Boys Love You, or even Keepin' the Summer Alive. If you ask him about the 96% hearing loss in his right ear, his story might change. My father hit me, he might say. Or he'll say, I was born like that. Perhaps one day it'll be, my dad hit me in the side of the head with a 2x4. That's one possibility, and I think his most recent explanation was that he was playing with a kid in the neighborhood one day, and the kid accidentally hit him in the face with a 2x4. But you get my point. As was the norm for seeing Brian Wilson in the East Coast, Lisa and I would get together with our friends for dinner beforehand. There was our friend Susan. She actually ran a couple of Beach Boys fan conventions. I want to think our friend Dan was there, but I don't remember for sure. That is, I should say, East Coast Dan. We also have a friend in Chicago, actually lives just a couple of blocks away, also named Dan, who's part of the Beach Boys fan crowd, but he didn't go to New York. David Feldman, the author of the Imponderables books such as When Do Fish Sleep, Do Penguins Have Knees, etc., he joined us as well, as did our friend Christine, who, like Lisa and me, is a beagle lover, and she was also on friendly terms with one of Brian's band members, and I'll get back to that a little bit later. Making a surprise appearance was Leon and his wife Amy, and I say surprise because Leon lives in the Columbus area. For years, he's been the moderator of the Pet Sounds mailing list, which is an online Beach Boys fan discussion group. The discussions take place over email rather than, say, a web-based message board. I don't really remember much about dinner, but then again, despite its reputation for fine dining, I've seldom had a satisfying meal in New York City. The only places I've ever enjoyed the food in New York were at the sadly defunct Motown Cafe and at Junior's, and I cannot recommend Junior's enough. Wonderful place. What I do remember is that I ordered a side of spinach and never got it, but they still insisted on charging me for it. Thankfully, everybody at the table raised a stink on my behalf, talked to the manager, and got the spinach taken off the bill. Anyway, David and I spent a lot of time talking about the Chicago street numbering system. It's really fascinating. David lived in Chicago for a while. He also wondered aloud why Nelson Bragg, who at the time was Brian Wilson's secondary percussionist, Nelson would sometimes strike a cymbal with his bare hand instead of with a drumstick. Was it that you get a slightly different sound? Was it that he was just getting so into the music he didn't realize he wasn't using a drumstick? The world may never know. After dinner, during the walk over to the Beacon Theater, Lisa and I talked about our first time seeing Brian Wilson in concert in June 1999, and it was at the Beacon. It was Brian's first solo tour, and many fans were just resigned to the belief that we'd never get to see him in concert, so that solo tour was a pleasant shock. We both recalled how, after the show, we were just on cloud nine, but we also agreed there was no way Brian would ever agree to do a tour again, judging from how obviously scared he was. Oh, what fools we mortals be. The man has been consistently touring ever since. In the back of my mind, though, I was also recalling how the acoustics at the Beacon were terrible, at least for the size band that Brian has. He has lots of backup musicians. We saw Brian at the Beacon in 1999 and again in 2003, and both times the sound was a giant ball of mess. However, the Beacon had just recently been renovated, so I was holding on to hope for better sound than before. Going to a Brian Wilson concert in New Jersey or New York City was always a spot the famous person game. Look around the audience and you might see Paul Schaefer, Sean Lennon, Brian's friend and former biographer David Leaf, Dennis Dyken from the Smithereens. In fact, a friend of ours actually introduced Dennis to us once. And now that I think about it, I've never been to a Brian Wilson show in Jersey or New York and not seen Dennis Dyken. He never misses a Brian Wilson show, and his height and style are easy to spot in a crowd. This time I also saw David Marks, who was a Beach Boy for about a year or so in the early days while Al Jardine left the band to go back to college. Again, more about spot the famous person later on. Thankfully, it turned out that I needn't worry about the acoustics. There was a noticeable improvement in the sound, although it still wasn't perfect. But overall, it was a really great show. One thing noteworthy was Al Jardine joining the band a few songs in. The band started playing Then I Kissed Her, a song Al sang on the Beach Boys' 1965 album Summer Days and Summer Nights, and he walked on stage during the intro. Especially interesting was that it meant that Brian Wilson's solo concert now had literally twice as many original Beach Boys as the group that was touring using the name The Beach Boys. Go figure. But anyway, that night, Al sang lead on other songs that he either wrote or sang lead on with the Beach Boys, such as California and I Know There's an Answer. Oh, and since I mentioned I Know There's an Answer, I might as well talk about easily the most memorable moment of the show. Before the band performed God Only Knows, Brian said that of all the songs he wrote, that was the one he was the most proud of. After God Only Knows finished, the audience gave him a loud, raucous, and long standing ovation. Brian said his thanks, and we all responded by getting louder. He then said, "Okay, you can stop now." But we got even louder. The band realized that there would be no end to the applause, so Darian Sahanaja, the main keyboardist in the group, took it upon himself to go just straight into I Know There's an Answer. Ever since then, Lisa and I have made damn well sure that we rise to our feet at the end of God Only Knows at every Brian Wilson concert we attend. I guess there's no reason we shouldn't. After all, it's Lisa's favorite song. After the show, our little group was just hanging out for a while outside by the stage door, and behind us there was a tour bus. And while we were just talking amongst ourselves, the shade in the windshield just suddenly went up. And who was there in the front seat but Brian Wilson himself, just sitting there, staring straight ahead blankly. Brian has a reputation of being kind of awkward in public settings, so naturally he wasn't going to come out of the bus to greet people and give everybody giant warm hugs, especially after a 2-hour show. But people were standing in front of the bus and having their friends take their pictures. Frankly, it was pretty disgusting, essentially turning Brian into a museum exhibit. Nobody in our little group was pleased with the behavior we saw. Meanwhile, Christine had talked to her friend in the band. Said friend had told her there would be 5 tickets to the next evening's show waiting for her at will call before the concert. Bring some friends, she was told. Among those friends would be David again, and Christine offered 2 tickets to Leon and Amy. The only problem was Leon and Amy were supposed to fly back home the day of that show, but they would try to change their flight so they could have this experience again. Unfortunately, Amy and Leon couldn't change the scheduled flight, but fortunately, Christine offered their tickets to Lisa and me. What? See our idol do another concert and all we have to do is cover our New Jersey Transit fare? Sure, I guess we can do that. The date now is Wednesday, November 22nd, 2006, the day before Thanksgiving. I don't remember anything about the day at all before our Free Brian Wilson concert at the Beacon. I don't remember the train ride. I don't remember how we got to the train. I don't remember dinner. I don't even remember where we had dinner. I just remember the concert. We met up with Christine before the show, along with the other 2 lucky recipients of the free tickets. I feel bad that I don't remember recipient number 5. Maybe it was Susan again? I don't know. Oh, well. Sure enough, there was an envelope with Christine's name on it, but the envelope didn't just contain concert tickets. It also included all-access passes. Whoa. As for the concert, this time there wasn't an endless standing ovation for God only knows, but believe me, Lisa and I sure gave it the old college try. This time, Al Jardine did not walk out on stage during the intro of Then I Kissed Her. Instead, the stage lights went down briefly, and when they came back up, suddenly there was Al and his guitar, as if he'd just apparated. Again, though, it was a great show, and we had all access passes, but Lisa didn't want to be a bother and just hang out forever, though. She just wanted to use those all access passes to go backstage and thank Christine's friend in the band, whom we had met on several occasions. In fact, said band member has even waved at us from the stage if said band member spotted us in the crowd. By the way, I'm going to continue referring to said band member as said band member, just to respect said band member's privacy in this regard. After the show, we were directed to go off to the side so that we could be briefed on what would happen during the after show. The guy talking saw the passes Lisa and I were wearing, and he said, "Oh, you 2 have all access passes. You can just go right in." Okay. So he opened the backstage door, and there we were. We spotted Christine's band member friend right away, so we chatted with that person for a few minutes, and indeed we thanked that person. But instead of leaving, we just kind of got caught up in the atmosphere. I saw Darian Sahanaja, who himself is a brilliant musician and songwriter, and was very instrumental in the revival of the Smile album. Lisa told me that if she ever met Darian, she'd thank him for helping Brian finish the Smile album. Darian was also part of a Los Angeles power pop band called Wondermints. He and his childhood friend and birthday buddy Nick Walusko were the 2 main members of Wondermints, and both are in Brian Wilson's band, as is fellow Wondermint Mike D'Amico, who's also Brian's current drummer, and Probin Gregory, who can play just about every instrument under the sun. Probin calls himself an auxiliary Wondermint. But Wondermints are one of my favorite bands, actually, and for the longest time, Cellophane, which D'Amico wrote, was my favorite Wondermints song, and in fact, just about every Wondermints fan I've ever encountered also said, yeah, Cellophane's my favorite Wondermints song too. However, in 2002, Wondermints had released an album called Mind If We Make Love to You. One of Darian's songs, Shine on Me, blew me away and quickly became one of my favorites. But getting back to the after show, I walked over to Darian and I introduced myself. I said, first of all, on behalf of my wife, thank you for helping Brian finish Smile. Darian just kind of shyly smiled, looked down, and said, almost under his breath, that was all Brian. Typical Darian. He has a reputation for being extremely humble, and he made it clear that he doesn't want any credit for his friend and idol's masterpiece. Then I said, and thank you for Shine on Me. You gave me a song that's now giving Cellophane a good fight to be my favorite Wondermints song. And Darian said, you know what? Last night, someone came up to me with her cell phone and showed me that she had Shine on Me as her ringtone. As we were talking, Lisa came over and said, did you thank him for helping Brian finish Smile for me? And we both assured her that yes, I did. I said, Darian, this is my wife, Lisa. She loves your vocal on Barbarella. Wondermint's second album was an all-covers album, and Darian indeed did a very nice reading of the theme from the famous Bee Movie. Lisa always remarked how the song's sound made her think of 60s era airports and airplanes, and she envisioned classic Pan Am jets and classic Pan Am stewardesses. So she said to Darian, "Yeah, Barbarella is so Pan Am." Darian's eyes practically bugged out of his head. He said, and I quote, "That's exactly the vibe I was going for!" He was so excited that somebody got his music. It wasn't the first time we met Darian, and from my past experience, I learned that he's very shy about his own music and, I don't know, seems to be fearful that if he does any promotion for it whatsoever, it would be shameful egotism. He just doesn't understand that there are people out there who love his music. But Darian told us that Wondermints used to perform Barbarella when they'd play at the now-defunct Sky High restaurant over at LAX, and how he'd sing the song while planes were landing and taking off behind him. Darian said that at those gigs, the band actually would be rechristened the After Dinner Mints. And by the way, if you've ever seen the first Austin Powers movie, International Man of Mystery, you have heard Wondermints. Al Jardine was backstage mingling too, and we managed to sneak in a few words with him. Lisa complimented him on his I Know There's an Answer vocal that night. Al said, "Isn't that a great song? I've always loved that song." That was a pleasantly unexpected reply. The commonly reported Beach Boys lore was that the group didn't really care for what Brian was doing with Pet Sounds. Yet, as the years have gone by, evidence has been uncovered little by little that show that simply was not necessarily true. In 1973, on the Beach Boys' Holland album, Al collaborated with Beach Boy Mike Love on a 3-song suite called California Saga, and the third part of the suite, simply called California, was released as a single and was a minor hit. Brian and the band performed the song that night with Al singing lead, of course. Lisa told Al that she loved that he mentioned Travels with Charlie in the lyrics. Al said, "I'll let you in on a little secret. I didn't actually read the book." Lisa later said that hearing that broke her heart. Al should not have said that to an English teacher. I told her, well, you should have known that Al never read Travels with Charlie because Charlie's name is misspelled in the lyrics sheet. Also backstage was Wondermint Nick Walusko, who's usually introduced on stage as Nicky Wonder. I knew he had been working on a solo album, so I asked him when it'd be coming out. He said, "Soon, I hope." 12 years later, the album, called Memories of Tomorrow, still isn't out, although one track, an instrumental called Bionicle, has come out on a podcast or something. I highly recommend seeking that tune out. It's a fantastic track. The aforementioned Nelson Bragg was also backstage, and I think pretty much everybody in our free ticket quintet, as it were, chatted with him for a bit. David, of course, took the opportunity to ask the magic question, why do you sometimes hit the cymbal with your hand and sometimes with a drumstick? Do you get a different sound out of it or something? Nelson's response was, it's mostly just for show. I had heard that Nelson had played drums on the theme song from the cartoon The Replacements, and that the official credit on that song is Wondermints. After all, Darian's day job is with Disney. So I asked Nelson, are you officially a Wondermint? Nelson said, no, but I am a Now person, a Mellow Cad, and he continued on a laundry list of bands he was involved in at the time, besides, of course, the Mellow Cads and the Now people. But it was at that point when I first heard what is now known among Brian Wilson fans as the Bono Story. Nelson told us the story, prefacing it by saying, only Brian Wilson could get away with this shit. The story that Nelson told us took place in 2003 at the Ivor Novello Awards, where Brian was receiving an, I quote, Special International Award. At the reception afterwards, the waiters were all wearing black, and at some point Bono, who of course is known for his habit of wearing black, came over to Brian and poured his heart out. Brian, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm such a huge fan. Your music has been such a big inspiration to me. So what did Brian say in response? Thanks. Can you get me a Diet Coke? And as Nelson told us, the kicker, Bono actually got Brian the Diet Coke. Lisa had wondered for years after that, did Brian not know that it was Bono, or did he know full well that it was indeed Bono, and he just wanted to see what he could get away with, what he could get Bono to do, just for his own amusement? Either thought was reasonable, especially because Brian is known to have a bizarre sense of humor. In his recent memoir, Brian actually retold the Bono story and said he didn't know it was Bono. There are actually a lot of similar stories about Brian Wilson. When I told my Chicago friend Dan the story, in fact, he said, you know, I've heard that story, but it wasn't that story. That's a typical comment from Dan, and I know exactly what he meant. There's the Don Henley story, the Queen Elizabeth story, but I digress. Interestingly, I also saw Richie Havens backstage. It never crossed my mind that I'd see him at a Brian Wilson show, but I guess it makes sense being a fellow 60s legend. I didn't talk to him, though, and even more interestingly, at least to me, it wouldn't be the last time that I saw Richie Havens in a completely unexpected setting, although it shouldn't have been completely unexpected at all. But now I need to rewind a little bit and talk about what went on earlier while we were backstage, I think before we even talked to Darian. Lisa and I were just hanging out, and who walks into the room but the man himself, Brian freaking Wilson. He walked in and poured himself a glass of water. Lisa grabbed my hand and said, "Come on." We were walking in Brian's general direction all of a sudden. Honey, what are you doing?" I said. Clutching my hand, she kept walking, so naturally I had to follow. Still in Brian's direction, but not as general right now. "Honey, what are you doing? Honey, what are you doing?" And then suddenly there we were, standing next to Brian Wilson, just the two of us. Nobody else. You'd think there'd be a big crowd around him of adoring fans, but nope, just Brian and the two of us. I don't know how she managed to do this, but the next thing I know, Lisa said, "Hi, Brian." Brian put down the pitcher of water and smiled. "My name is Lisa, and this is my husband, Sean." He smiled again. He said, "Hi, Lisa," and he shook her hand. Whoa. Then he shook my hand, still smiling. Suddenly, time stopped. I remember having to arch my head at a surprisingly large angle to make eye contact with him. Brian's a tall guy. He's 6'4", but I'm tall too, 6'2", but still somehow I needed to arch my neck pretty significantly. I don't know how that works. I made eye contact with him and noticed how extremely blue his eyes were. And as I shook Brian's hand, I immediately thought of the scene in Trading Places when Ophelia remarks about Winthorpe's soft hands, saying, "Never done a hard day's work in your life, have you?" But there I was, making physical contact with one of the most revered composers of the 20th century, one of my musical heroes. And I said, "Thank you for your music, Brian. We met because of Pet Sounds." Brian laughed and said, "Whoa, great!" And still smiling, he walked away. The encounter was all of 8 seconds, and it still stuns me to this day. You see, you never know what you're going to get with Brian Wilson. He might listen to you for a few minutes. He might be very shy and not even make eye contact, or you might get a very brief 8-second meeting. But you should never expect him to be warm and welcoming with open arms. He just doesn't do that. Lisa and I were thrilled with those 8 seconds. He was polite, he was smiling, he listened to what we had to say, and really we had nothing more to say beyond thank you. His music gives us joy, it gives us deep thought, it gave us our marriage. We met Brian Wilson. The only thing that could possibly top that in this lifetime would be meeting a Beatle. During the entire time we spent backstage, we managed to keep our cool when we were talking to everybody, including Brian. Talking to them as we would talk to anybody else we know personally, really. We left, said our goodbyes to our friends, and started to head down Broadway to make our way to Penn Station. But suddenly, right there on the sidewalk, the experience of shaking hands with our hero caught up to Lisa. She stopped dead in her tracks and just broke down in tears. Tears of joy, tears of amazement, tears of shock. Lisa said normally she would have expected to have that reaction as the moment happened, but there was something that night that just delayed that overwhelming emotion. We never did think of having pictures taken or getting autographs. Well, the autograph thing is fine. We have several things autographed by Brian, some even in person. Instead, we have the all-access pass from that night in a frame as a memento of that evening. People often say, "Don't meet your heroes." Well, why not? Lisa and I met Brian Wilson, our hero. It was an 8-second experience, but it says something that I dedicated an entire Music for Schnooks segment to talk about those 8 seconds. The next day, as we ate our turkey, we had a lot more to be thankful for than we did 24 hours earlier. Well, this is not the first time that I've told this story. Between Lisa and me, the story of our meeting Brian Wilson has been told many, many times since 2006, and I'm sure it'll be told many times more. There will be further Don't Meet Your Heroes segments on Music for Schnooks and possibly not Music for Schnooks. So if you enjoyed that story, hopefully you'll enjoy future stories involving meeting one's heroes. In the meantime, though, that's the end of this chapter. Yeah, that sounded so cliche, didn't it? Oh well. And I thank you for listening to my stories. I guess now would be as good a time as any to remind you of ways you can keep in touch with Autobiography of a Schnook. You can email me at autobio@schnookpodcast.com. And of course, schnookpodcast.com is the podcast's website. And on that site, if you click on chapters, you will see the online bibliography for this and previous episodes. And you can also download this and previous episodes at that same link. My Twitter handle is Schnook Podcast, and my Instagram handle is also Schnook Podcast. As usual, my thanks to Lisa for her support, and thank you all for your support. Thank you for listening. I really do appreciate it. What's coming up next with Autobiography of a Schnook? Well, more stories, duh! But in the meantime, I hope those of you who celebrate Thanksgiving are having a wonderful time. And to the Joliet Catholic Hilltoppers, please, once and for all, let's put Montini away. I'll talk to all of you again in the next chapter. But in the meantime, please remember the good goes around. And I really hope you'll make an effort to make sure that it keeps going around. And now that I got this chapter out of the way, I'm going to do my annual Thanksgiving tradition of visiting Terminal A of Newark International Airport. Please wish me luck.
It's 5:14 this beautiful, dreary afternoon. Hope you're enjoying your leftover turkey. And let's see if you can enjoy the weather, too. Today, it's going to be cloudy and drizzly with a high of about 52. And tonight, possibility of rain with a low of 35. And tomorrow, cold. And a possibility of rain changing to snow with a high of 37. I always thought that the freezing point was 32. So how can there be snow if it's 37 degrees? I don't know. I never was very good in science. But right now, it's 44 degrees here at the Cat, 105.5. Coming up later, Deep Purple, Everclear, Soul Asylum, and tons of other great rock. That's what we are, a cool rock on the Cat 105.5.